Good evening and welcome back to 31 Horror Nights. It's October 30th and tonight's movie is Apostle. This is a 2018 movie about a man who visits a cult that lives on an island because he wants to rescue his sister. Obviously, the idea of island cults conjures imagery of the Wicker Man, and this film also has the same sort of folk horror influence. One thing I find kind of interesting is that the writer/director of this movie, Gareth Evans, is not known for directing horror movies. He's not even known for directing movies in English. He's known for directing Indonesian action movies, like martial arts films. I don't really know how this came to pass as his next movie after directing 3 of those. But it does have a pretty stacked cast. The lead is the guy who played the Beast in the live-action remake of Beauty and the Beast. You know, that one that made so much money it sent Disney down this horrible rabbit hole of live-action remakes. One that is arguably still going even now, 8 years later. Yeah, that one. And the villain, the cult leader in this movie, is played by Michael Sheen, who's like a big deal actor. Not to be confused with Martin Sheen or Charlie Sheen. Anyway, this movie looks kind of brutal. It looks like it's not going to shy away from the violence, though I usually find with cults the scarier part is the way that they can take over the minds of the people following them. Anyone can murder somebody, but it takes a lot of time and conditioning to make them willingly murder themselves. And I can't really think of anything else I want to say. This movie's kind of long, so I'm just going to get started. Apostle is one of those movies that I was kind of neutral towards for most of it, but I didn't like the ending, and by the ending I literally mean the very last shot of the film. So if its final impression on me is not a good one, it's kind of hard for me to give it a good score if there wasn't really anything else in the movie to balance that out. I'm going to give Apostle a 5 out of 10. One kind of missed opportunity / disappointing thing about this film is that it really does not dive into the psychological aspect of cults pretty much ever. And I guess it wasn't this movie's obligation to dive into that, but that's a really interesting thing to examine. Midsummer. I didn't exactly love that movie, but I did enjoy that aspect of it. I'm normally not a fan of these historical horror movies because they tend to just be dreary as hell. And while visually this movie is about as appealing as something like The Witch or The Nightingale, I will say the score to this film was very interesting, in a good way. Had a lot of that Celtic folk music vibe. I don't know if that's the right way to describe it, but I did enjoy it. And there were a couple of really good moments of string work. It's sort of like some of the songs in Silk Song where he gets really aggressive. The score is usually something you only notice if it's really good or really bad, and this is really good. I feel like the 2 main parts where this movie could have gotten terror from, the idea of the cult and the idea of this folk horror entity, I found both of those aspects of this movie kind of underwhelming. Though there was one character in this movie. I read the Wikipedia article and they refer to this character as the Grinder. I don't think they ever actually say that in the movie, but I'll call it that anyway. That character actually did have some aura, some presence. Kind of an interesting design. It looks like a human male, but shirtless and with brown pants and a completely obscured face. I thought it was curly hair that was matted down with blood because the entire torso is covered with blood. But it looks almost like twine wrapped around his head so many times it completely obscures his face and hair. I actually don't know what the deal with the Grinder is. Was he an acolyte at one point who gave himself to this cult and this ritual, or was he a supernatural entity that came with the territory? Because the central figure of this cult is this forest goddess. You see, these are some of the things I feel this movie could have dove into a little bit more. I'd say for the most part this movie just sort of gave me what I expected, except for the very end, but I'll talk about that in the spoiler section. Overall, this isn't really the type of movie I normally would gravitate towards. But putting my own biases aside, I feel overall it's just kind of okay, kind of mid, except for the ending, which was very confusing to me. And to talk about that further, I'm going to go into spoilers now. Going back to them not really utilizing the cult aspect of this movie properly, to begin with, this cult has 3 leaders. That's barely a cult. What kind of cult has 3 leaders? The entire thing is going to collapse when they turn on each other, and that is exactly what happens in this movie. Normally in these types of movies, the source of worship would be the supernatural entity that this cult revolves around, but that doesn't really seem to be the case here. The 3 founders of this cult are Malcolm, who is Michael Sheen's character, Quinn, whose only purpose seems to be being as evil as possible, and Frank, who, honestly, I don't know why he's there. I don't know what purpose he serves to the narrative. Anyway, the cult kidnaps the main character, Thomas's sister, so that they could get a ransom from the family because they need to pay for animal sacrifices. The reason why they are able to self-sustain on this island, or at least try to self-sustain, is that they make blood sacrifices to this forest spirit that they kind of have held hostage. But the sacrifices just don't seem to be doing as much lately, and they kind of need to up the ante or else all the crops are going to die and everyone's going to starve. Which is kind of ironic because they are trying to rely on outside help in order to bolster their own self-sustainability, which kind of defeats the purpose. But anyway, Thomas just cares about getting his sister back. And by the way, there's a whole thing where he used to be a missionary for Christianity, but he lost his faith during a really bad experience when he was in China. This was the Boxer Rebellion. They treat that like it's a big deal, but ultimately doesn't really affect the story that much. Anyway, eventually Thomas gets captured and attempted to be tortured and murdered by the grinder, but it's kind of a weird thing. He's like strapped to a table, you know, like that torture device, the rack, except instead of like stretching him until he like falls apart, it's like pulling him into this like rolling pin meat grinder type of thing. And I gotta say, this is a terrible design for a torture device. It's dragging him into the grinder by the things that are attaching him and like restraining him, so once his hands get mangled, he can free those hands and use those to escape. Also, in order to operate this, you need to be grinding it basically right next to the face of the person you're trying to kill, so you have easy access. He eventually uses this to like turn the tables and defeat the grinder. However, the way that this fight ultimately ends was so visually confusing. I saw it like 2 or 3 times and I have no idea what happened. Anyway, this happens in like the same barn that they're holding captive the guardian of this island. And she like shows him what has been happening to her and asks him to free her. And he ends up technically granting her wish by setting her on fire. And in result, the entire island starts like spontaneously combusting. There's also a point where like a giant piece of rock breaks off a cliff and there's blood pouring out of it. At that point, everybody is either dead or has evacuated except for Thomas and Malcolm, both of which are injured, but Thomas is a lot more injured. And as he bleeds out, when his blood hits the ground, you see the same sort of effect that happened every time they fed the forest guardian, like blood. Like the plants started to get more lively and sprouting flowers. But then the plants like impale his skin and his eyes start turning into the same like blotchy, blind appearance of the forest guardian. So I guess that means that he is the new guardian of this island. And that was like the final shot of the movie, and I was so confused by this. It doesn't really make sense to view this as a happy ending because Thomas wasn't exactly lacking purpose throughout the movie. He had a defined purpose, saving his sister, and he seemed very satisfied to just die after he accomplished that. He also does seem to have regained his faith, so I don't know how exactly he's supposed to feel about being this pagan deity for the rest of eternity, I guess. And it doesn't really make sense if this is supposed to be a bad ending either. The forest deity, they just refer to her as her, seemed to have taken a liking to Thomas from the beginning. So it doesn't really make sense that she would try to punish him at the end of it all, especially considering the fact that Malcolm, one of the people who imprisoned her, is also there. Why not punish him? If this was meant to be a reward, that doesn't really make a lot of sense because you even see her before she was imprisoned. She didn't seem to be living a happy existence at that point either. And if it's a punishment, why would you direct it at the one that put you out of your misery instead of one of the people who put you in that misery? I know I'm nitpicking, but that does seem to fit like how things just sort of happen in this movie, and there isn't really much of a reason provided. But that is probably a lot more personal to me. Overall, if you like historical horror movies, this is probably going to be okay to you, I guess. Overall, I just kind of thought it was whatever. Alright, thank you for listening. And holy smokes, tomorrow is Halloween, the finale. I'll see you then.